It's time to get the story behind the story. Interviews with newsmakers, news breakers, and Vermonters making a difference. WCAX presents 802 News with Mark Johnson. Here's Mark.
Nationwide, the decline in local newspapers has been dramatic. By the end of this year, almost a third of the newspapers publishing 20 years ago will be gone. Some of the 6,000 remaining, like the once dominant Burlington Free Press, are a shadow of their former selves. The shuttering of print publications and the hemorrhaging of jobs in journalism are blamed on the rise of social media and a subsequent major drop-off in advertising revenue. That trend accelerated during the pandemic. Today, hundreds of counties across the country are considered news deserts with no local news coverage at all. That means less accountability for public officials and a less informed community. In this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company, I spoke with 7 Days reporter Colin Flanders about the analysis he and his colleague Kevin McCallum conducted about the health of print media in Vermont. It's not a pretty picture, with many news outlets fighting for their financial survival. I'm here with Colin Flanders. You, along with your cohort, Kevin McCallum, wrote, I thought, this really interesting story looking at the state of the Vermont media. As we all know, nationally, newspapers are really in a lot of trouble. What prompted you to even look into this?
Yeah, so I think there are a few things happening right now. One, there was a big journalism conference, the third year, just last month, and I attended it and was really struck by the common goal that everyone had, which is just to survive. And I think it was remarked at the conference, like, not everywhere in the country could you find news publishers in a room like that together, racking their brains on how do we make this thing work. I think that's one. I think two, we at 7 Days are feeling the pressures that everyone else are feeling. And so when you're looking for things to write about, often you'll overhear things in the newsroom. Just the idea that it's a really hard time right now. And I think three, as we're approaching yet another presidential election, we've seen over the last few years the real importance of having trusted news sources. And we've seen some things pop up around the state about news outlets under a lot of pressure and maybe even closing. And so I think those things were coming together. We were taking a look at how do we get our arms around this and really write the story to help people understand where we're at in this moment in time, and that is in some trouble.
As you reported, this did start before the pandemic, and you note that it really started with the digital revolution, digital age. I wasn't exactly sure. I could guess that it's sort of Facebook ads, but tell me more about what you meant by that phrase and that problem for newspapers.
Yeah, so if you think about the traditional funding sources of any newspaper over history, it has been two things. It's been subscriptions, so people paying you to read your content, whether to have your newspaper delivered to their homes or to buy it on newsstands, and businesses taking out ads. Paying to have a spot in the newspaper where where readers can see what you're offering. Both of those have been completely upended because of the internet. And so if you think about a business 25 years ago, the best way to reach a potential customer would have been to throw your name in the newspaper. It gets delivered to 40, 50,000 people. Nowadays, if you open up Facebook, you can spend maybe $20 and have that ad blasted out to a mile radius around you, and you're accomplishing in some ways the same thing. Now, there are obviously questions about how much people engage with the torrent of ads that are coming at them on social media, but I think from a business point of view, there are many more ways to get your message out. We even encounter sometimes in the news business where businesses don't even want to tell you the news. They feel like they can control their message. They make a post on Instagram, here's why we're closing, and they cut you right out of it. So that's one thing. I think, two, there are so many more ways to get your news these days that people just don't have a lot of attention right now. They don't have a lot of attention to sit down and read the newspaper. It is harder and harder to capture people's attention. And so that shows up, one, in subscription numbers. A lot of newspapers are seeing their subscription numbers plummet. And then two, it's also just harder to keep them even on your website. And newspapers are constantly trying to figure out ways, how do we engage people? How do we make sure that we're a part of their life and have to be? Whereas 40 years ago, you could count on the newspaper newspaper every day showing you what you need. Nowadays, there are so many different ways to learn about what's going on. And that's really hard for a business that relies on those eyeballs. Those eyeballs are in many ways translated directly to dollars.
I taught a course at Champlain College just down the street here, a Journalism 101, and I asked the students, where do you get your news from? What's your primary news source? TikTok was the number one answer. And I thought, wow.
Yeah. And you know, when you think about it, or TikTok or Twitter or Facebook, most often the news that they think they're getting from those outlets are coming from newspapers or news outlets. The news is still being covered really closely by a lot of organizations, but that message then gets distributed through all of these other channels that we can't monetize. And so that's a real challenge. And I think one thing that I found interesting in the story is I'm 30 years old. I've been in the business about 10 years. And when I was in college at St. Michael's, we were having discussions about, will there be a job for us when we get out of here? The news business was already going through this change, but it wasn't always like that. I mean, there were 20, 30 years ago, newspapers were still viewed as profit generators. I talked to a couple news publishers. They were like, in the 80s and 90s, we were turning good profits. We were able to make a really good living off of this. And that was striking for me. I kind of always felt like we've always been in this position, but it's not the case. It's been really the last 20 years that we've gone through this evolution. And I think that's why it's taken some time for us to adapt. And I think there are people out there who think the news should be doing a lot more to adapt.
You mentioned the mid-'80s. I'll age myself here or date myself here. I worked at the Burlington Free Press from 84 to 87, and it was a cash cow. I mean, it literally was referred to as a printing press. You, at one point, talk about their newsroom, and there were literally 50 to 60 reporters there. Maybe there's 6 now. But it was literally called a printing press.
Yeah, that's totally right. And I think that especially the younger generation, they don't think of newspapers that way. But it is not the case anymore. I mean, it is really, really hard to sustain, especially a print newspaper, which comes with all the costs of just producing the thing. I mean, I talked to the Addison Independent, which estimates around mid 30,000 per issue just to get that paper out on newsstands. 7 days, I think we're maybe in the 50,000 range. I mean, that's a lot of money every single week. And you have to, one of the ironies I mentioned in the story is we could be doing more work now than they were doing in the 80s. We could be trying to reach people online, on TikTok. We could be making little Instagram reels. Those are all things that take a lot of time and energy and have very little payoff. And so that's the challenge is how do you try to make people care about what you're doing in a way that will make money? And no one has a good answer at this moment. You
mentioned the rise of social media. That, I would say, in the 1-2 punch, the second punch was the pandemic.
Yeah, that's totally right. I mean, I think that not only did the pandemic just disrupt all types of businesses, it was hard for us to pay the bills, but overnight, many newspapers saw their main revenue source dry up. If you think it ebbs and flows with the economy, businesses were losing customers. They didn't have money to spend. And when you look at your budget, you think, what can I cut here? Am I going to cut my frontline cashiers, or am I going to cut my advertising budget? And so overnight, the money dried up. Thankfully, some of the government funding helped cover that. But now 3 years later, that's gone. And we're in this position where nobody really knows how do we make this work for the next 20, 30 years.
I did not until I read your story, though, because we all know nationally it's just the whole newspaper industry has been basically decimated. But I did not realize the number you cite here in this article in Vermont, that the number of people working in the industry has gone from 1,446 people in 2000 to 358. Wow.
I know. And I think that's one of the things I was hoping to accomplish with this story is that not a lot of people realize the extent of how much trouble news organizations are in. And I think part of that is because Vermont news outlets have been hanging on even when sometimes they maybe shouldn't have been. I mean, we haven't had a wave of newspaper closures as they have had in other parts of the country. Everybody knows about the Free Press and their decline, and I think people can see that. But also we have 7 Days, which is less than 30 years old. We have Vermont Digger, which is 15 years old. So there's been some bright spots, and I think a lot of people don't realize you got to look a little beyond the surface to see there are a lot less people trying to do the same amount of work, and that's really hard. And I think there is a question of whether we're even accomplishing that. I mean, I don't know how you could cover a state as well with 6 reporters as you did with 60. The mathematics don't work.
And then there used to always be AP and UPI to fall back on to kind of fill in the gaps, and they are just a complete shadow of their former selves too.
That's completely right. And I think one of the new things is, so the Addison Independent, one of the newspapers I profiled, they were in the New York Times 10 years ago as an example of local journalism actually still making it work. The story at that point, maybe around 2013, was that the mid-sized regional dailies, such as the Free Press, the Baltimore Suns, the middle ground between maybe the Times and some of the more local outlets, they were really struggling. But the hyper-local outlets were still making it work because that was the only place that you could really get some of that news content, the school board stuff, the local sports content. Right. Fast forward 10 years later, even that is under threat because you can pop open Facebook and find some of those same things. And so I think the challenges have been only accelerating over the last handful of years to the point where there is no news outlet, at least in the print sphere, that is not struggling right now.
You know, you mentioned that people didn't realize the extent to which newspapers and places like Digger are really struggling. I was blown away. I'm not sure how you got them to even give you this number, but you talk about Vermont Digger had lost a combined $1.7 million over the past 2 years. That's breathtaking. And how are they able to even keep going?
Yeah, so in Digger in particular, I was really interested in their story because one of the things that we're constantly hearing as maybe the savior of journalism is philanthropy, is the idea that if we can convince enough people that this is a public service worthy of paying for in the same way we might fund the arts or the museums, right, that maybe that'll help generate enough revenue to sustain us. But that comes with challenges, just like traditional print advertising. It ebbs and flows with the economy. Some years donors are really, really giving. The economy turns and maybe they, just like a business is thinking about, maybe I don't have enough money to advertise. Some bigger donors are thinking maybe we need to cut back a little bit here. And I think Digger, I was actually surprised myself at how open they were about their struggles too. I mean, on one hand, they have to be as a nonprofit. That those figures are going to be out there eventually. But I think that they are trying to make the case to people that they are doing everything they can to be sustainable, but they need help. And that's the challenge that news organizations are in. If you come out and you say, listen, we're failing, and unless something changes, we're going to go under, as a donor or even as a business, do you want to put your money in that organization? Right. Maybe not. So we're walking a fine line here. But I do think, I mean, Digger in particular, they've been cutting back some of their staff through attrition. I think they're tightening their belts a little bit and they're trying to weather the storm. And they say they're doing it well, but I mean, time will tell how long they can manage that for.
Down now to 13. As you know, I worked there for 5 years. I mean, they're now down to 13 reporters. I was trying to remember how many we had kind of at the peak, or they had at the peak. But now the ratio is 13 reporters, 7 editors.
They're going through some of the same things other newspapers are of where should we be putting the money and where do we get the best bang for the buck? And I think that often lies in how do we make sure we're producing enough content to make people feel like we need to be a part of their life every week. You can't miss us. And I think at 7 Days, that's what we try to do, be a source of enough news, enough surprise, enough intrigue, and also entertainment that people feel like when that's out on newsstands, I got to pick it up. How do you do that? It's different for everybody.
And to be fair, there are editors at Digger that are also writing stories. I mean, I see Paul Heintz's name out there all the time. There's a lot of stories credited to VTD editors. So, but go back to a point you were making before. I think this is really one of the big parts of the story is just this whole shift, and it's a pretty dramatic shift in how newspapers are funded. You know, the Free Press was 100% advertising or other, you know, people paying for obituaries. I remember the first time I heard that, I thought, wow, people are paying for obituaries. That's so awful. But, you know, that advertising, and now it's really all about philanthropy and grants. And that's a real change.
It is a real change, and I think newspapers are trying to figure out what's the most diverse mix of revenue we can have to make sure that when things go bad, the entire ship doesn't go down. And so I don't think anybody who's still in the for-profit sector wants to put all their eggs in the philanthropy basket, because it is hard. And I think one thing I should clarify too about philanthropy, that's a lot of work to make that sustainable. It's not just putting a notice up on your website and saying, hey, we could use some money, and the money pours in. I mean, we're talking nonprofits all over of all sorts have to spend a lot of time and resources reaching out to donors, making sure that they feel like they're making a contribution that's going to make a difference in the world, and showing the impact of that work. And so I think there is still a place for advertising. I think if you talk to any news publisher who has advertising, they'll tell you we could use a lot more of it and we want more. But also I think they're increasingly realizing that is not a sustainable thing for the next 30 years. And so philanthropy is one option among a handful of others that are being batted around right now.
In your publication, 7 Days, the Addison Independent that you profiled as one of the 4 groups that you looked at here, I mean, clearly they're still, advertisers are their main source of revenue.
Yeah, that's totally right. And at the Addy Indy, I think it was around 85% advertising before they started asking for money. And even now, I don't think they're rolling in the dough from these donations. It's a really slow process. But I think the message to businesses is even a little, it's changing over time. The message used to be, give us some money, we'll put you in the paper, and it's a really good thing for your business. Now, it's also, think about the role that we play as a newspaper for your community, and maybe it's a little more of a philanthropic point of view from a business as well. As a local business, maybe I want to be making sure I'm spending my advertising dollars on an organization that's paying people in my community, that's helping people be informed, versus spending my money on Facebook and not having any idea where that's going afterward.
You and Kevin McCallum, who did this piece with you, you looked at the Addison Independent, you looked at Vermont Digger, you looked at the Waterbury Record, the Hardwick Gazette, which is a really solid weekly newspaper. How did you decide, when you're taking the pulse of what's going on in Vermont journalism, why'd you focus on those 4?
Yeah, so there are a few things we were looking for. I think one, we wanted a traditional newspaper, the type of newspaper you close your eyes to think about a newspaper, and that's what you think. And that's what I came up with the Addy Indy. It's still in print. It relies on advertising. I wanted to make sure that we had the voice, and they're still for profit, which I think often in this in the future of journalism, the conversation always goes to nonprofit, and I think there are many benefits to that, but I don't think for-profit needs to be painted in this light that it's just money-hungry owners who are ripping everything out of it. I think local owners like the Addy Indy, they've run it.
You mean unlike the pharmaceutical companies?
Yes, that's very right, Mr. Sanders. And I think that, so I wanted to focus on them. 2, Digger, obviously, they're one of the biggest news organizations in the state, and they are representative of that new wave of philanthropy. They're sort of like a rising star in the nonprofit world. You can see in some of these national organizations and outlets, they are holding them up as maybe this is the future. And so I thought it was helpful to take a look at, okay, well, how are they doing? What challenges are they running into? The Roundabout we were interested in because it was... One, it was like one of the newest newspapers around. It kind of rose from the ashes of a different version of a newspaper there. And it's hyper local. It's as local as you can get, covering just one town. And we wanted to take a look at what does that look like? How do you make that sustainable? And then with the Hardwick Gazette, it's another example of a nonprofit who trying to make it work. And I think what was interesting about them is they're taking a look at trying to get back into print. And you never hear about that. In the value that they are placing on a physical copy of a newspaper, what they think they might get out of that. And so I thought it gave an overview of many different angles, and hopefully it was interesting enough to readers.
Lisa Scalodi, who runs the Waterbury Record, also a Free Press alum like myself. And I mean, talk about a one-person band with a photographer. I mean, it's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, it totally is. And I thought about the Roundabout and sort of like, so if Digger's maybe the philanthropy angle, the Addy Indy is the trying to make it work traditionally and maybe asking for some help from readers. To me, the Roundabout was like just making it work on sheer will and making it work even when it probably shouldn't be working. I mean, I think that Lisa is doing something very few people would have the appetite for. And I don't know. I mean, she's very open about it. She doesn't know how long she can do it for. I mean, I think people should recognize that a lot of these newspapers are surviving not because they're making any money, but because the people who are producing them care enough. And that's hard. That's hard to sustain.
Let me ask you first, let me give you a real softball here. So what difference does it make whether these publications exist or don't exist?
Yeah. I mean, that's something that I thought about too as I was writing the story about if some newspaper in some town in the corner of Vermont closed, is anyone really going to notice? And so I think some newspapers that are out there now have been hanging on for so long that they are mostly glorified press releases. And I mean, I don't want to be too starry-eyed about it, this idea that newspapers have to exist in every single part of the state and they need to cover everything. Sometimes I don't think that's the case, but I do think that when they're working at their best, they provide something that nothing else can provide. They provide a way for you to get information about your community that you can trust, that you know somebody has taken a look at, has vetted, has maybe called a few people to check if it's right. Compare that to your local Facebook group, right, where somebody says, hey, we heard a loud bang in the backyard. And then the next comment is, well, it's obviously gunshots. And then from there, I mean, who knows? Yeah. So you need something you can trust. You need a way to interact with information that maybe you don't agree with. And I think that's something that you cannot get very often online. We know, I mean, everybody knows about the silos that get created because of the algorithms on these social media websites. And how often are you confronted with, I don't know how I feel about that idea. I think that's healthy for a democracy. Also, I mean, there's research that shows when newspapers close, in their wake, people do not stop consuming news. They still consume news. It's the type of news they consume is often hyper-partisan. And I don't think anyone will tell you that that's the antidote to the problems that we're facing right now is more partisanship, more polarization. So I think that newspapers play a really vital role. And once they're gone, they're very hard to get back.
You know, it's the partisanship. I agree with you. And then so I used to watch the CBS Evening News. I really can't even watch it anymore. The first story is a partisan political story, and then the second story is what I call the boy in a well story. And the kid could be in Honduras or in Houston, it doesn't really matter, but it's somehow appealing to something in my brain, to something base in all of us. So it's not, I mean, it's news, and I'm using quotes.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think that's why we're hearing more and more these days about one of the research terms, news avoidance. This idea that some people just are unplugging from the news,
totally,
because it makes them feel a way that they don't like to feel. And I think that's very rare. You'll feel that way if you're reading the local Addison Independent every week. I don't think you're going to walk away feeling like a lot more anxious about the world. I think you're going to feel like, oh, I live in a community where people care for each other, where fun things are happening, where maybe not so fun things are happening, but at least I know now, and maybe I can take some control. I have some agency. But you don't feel that way when you read about yet another tornado in Kentucky or a murder in California. I mean, I think there is something to be said about feeling connected to your local community.
Of course, now we're reading, it seems, every other day about floods in Vermont.
I know, exactly. As I said, the tornado thing. Maybe we should be reading about climate change, but yeah.
I'll be back in a moment to continue my discussion with Colin Flanders, a reporter at 7 Days, about the analysis he and colleague Kevin McCallum did about the health of print media in Vermont. First, a word from our sponsor. At Red Hen Baking Company, they believe pure, uncomplicated ingredients in the hands of skilled artisans are the building blocks for great food. They're dedicated to creating the best food from the best ingredients. You'll find an ever-changing lineup of delicious pastries, sandwiches, and soups at their beautiful cafe off Route 2 in Middlesex, just off I-89. Their breads are also available in many other locations. Led by owners Randy George and Eliza Kane, Red Hen Baking Company has been on the leading edge of the local food movement since 1999. Back to our discussion with 7 Days reporter Colin Flanders about the state of print media in Vermont.
How do you get, what did people tell you? How do you get readers to pay for something they've always basically gotten for free or cheap?
Yeah, well, I think part of it is what newspapers are trying to do, and my boss, Paula Routley, the publisher of 7 Days, is trying to do as well, is the idea that we need to let people know what it is we actually do and how much work it takes and how much money it takes, and be transparent about there is a bit of taking it for granted that the newspaper will always be around. And I think people need to understand that that is not the case. So how do you get somebody to pay for something that they haven't been paying for? Well, make them understand that if they don't, there is a consequence to that, that this might not always be around. And I think continue to be a vital part of their life, something they feel so attached to that they want to support. And I think that as a reporter, I mean, I'm often not waking up thinking, how can I make the paper money? I mean, that's usually the farthest thing from my mind. But what I do want to be is a vital part of someone's week, that they feel like, oh, there's another story. I really want to read that so I know what's going on. And after they finish reading that story, feel like, this is important to me. This means something. It's good to have, and maybe it is worth $5 a week to make sure that this can continue happening. That's why I have subscriptions of newspapers. I pay for the New York Times. I pay for some papers that I barely even read. But it's just the idea that I value this. It aligns with my values of an informed society, and I want to make sure that I'm supporting that in the same way I support other things.
But as you mentioned in your discussion about the Addison Independent, you can get a lot of buy-in from the local community, and it's just a whole lot more efficient, and you raise a lot more money if you can sell car ads, for example.
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge, is that we don't know if the reader donations are a silver bullet. I mean, they're not a silver bullet. And in the Addy Indy is learning, I think Angela was really open, Angela, the owner, about the challenge in sustaining something like that. Like, they came out with this big campaign in February. They got an initial rush of donations, and then from there it kind of petered out. Yeah. And it takes a lot of work to sustain something like that, to keep reminding people, hey, we're doing this campaign. We'd love it if you can help. And the challenge is we're already stretched thin. So to put that on top of everything else we're doing, it's really hard. And so one thing I will mention is there is a lot of movement nationally to try to help fund this through philanthropy. And one of the things mentioned in the story is this Press Forward initiative, where a group of major philanthropists have come together and vowed, in charitable foundations, vowed to invest $500 million across the country in local news. And the hope is that might generate even just start the conversation, but also make a difference financially. And so I don't know. The takeaway is we don't know what's going to work, and that's kind of a scary place to be.
Is there a danger in the philanthropy the same way people used to say, well, you're never going to write a critical article about the car industry if your newspaper's filled with automobile advertisements?
Totally. I mean, I can't think of a funding source for journalism that won't come with some of those same concerns. I mean, as someone who works in a business, I'm less concerned about that because I know that there are advertisers who we will write about, and we don't hear from the advertising side of the paper. Like, I understand there's a firewall. Readers, I don't know if everybody understands that. And so that's a challenge in making sure that people know that there is a firewall that exists between the people who are trying to raise the money and the people who are working on the content. But yeah, that's a concern.
If I give $25 a month to 7 Days, that doesn't inoculate me from being written about if I rob a bank or
Unfortunately, it doesn't. So I would suggest you don't rob a bank. But
okay. How about $50 a month? Talk about the burnout that reporters are feeling. I thought the quote that you got, that David Goodman, who's a longtime journalist, does work at Digger, also at WDEV Radio, who writes here, most of our state is not a news desert, which is sort of the new term for communities that have nobody covering them, but all the reporters feel like they're in a desert about to die of dehydration. I mean, what a great visual quote. Is it? Do you feel that? Do your colleagues feel that?
I think that anyone who's working in journalism today will tell you that they struggle with feelings of burnout. I think there's a few reasons for that. I mean, one, we work in a time now where people expect to know the news this moment. When something happens, they expect to know about it the moment it happens. And that's a good thing in some ways. It's good that we are able to do that. On the other hand, that's a big task. It's no longer that I can go out into the fields, gather up all the string, sit down at my desk, write it up, and then know that as long as I get it done by 8 p.m., it's in the newspaper the next day and it's going out to newsstands. I mean, you need to hustle. And often you're hustling. 7 days is a bit unique, but some of these newspapers, you're hustling multiple times a day. You're producing a lot of content. There is a lot of expectation on you. And the thing is, the statistics you cite, around close to 1,500 reporters or people working in journalism in 2000 compared to 358 in 2023. I don't think anyone will tell you fewer things are happening these days. I mean, the news is still happening. A lot of stuff is going on, and those few people are trying to cover it the best they can. And there is an expectation that they'll be at everything, at everywhere, and know about everything. It's really hard. It's really hard to do, and it's really hard to unplug. And that's something that a lot of journalists struggle with is being able to step away from the news and take a breath.
Well, what I find interesting about 7 days is, you've got this weekly publication that you put out that comes out on Wednesday. That would be enough right there for you as a full-time person to be coming up with these stories. I mean, I don't even know what this 6,000 word story. That's a lot of work, probably 20, 25 interviews maybe in the course of this. And then today, if something happens down the street here on Church Street, one of you guys is expected to go and cover it and get it out today so that I, as a consumer, know what's happened. Yeah. That's quite a balance to try to figure out how to do.
And I think we're constantly trying to figure out what's the best balance. I mean, at 7 days, I think in particular, we don't view ourselves as a paper of record in the way that some others do. And so there are times where we'll take a pass on something because we don't think it rises to the level of us needing to cover it. But other times there are too many things happening and you need to cover it. And I mean, I don't want to complain too much. I mean, that's part of the business. I'm very grateful to work in a profession like this where I can wake up and spend my time doing this work. I mean, it's a privilege, but at the same time, it is really hard some days. And so I think we as journalists haven't always been great at telling that story about what it takes to do this work. And part of that is because we don't like being at the center of the story. I mean, Angela, he's quoted in the story saying that, and it's really a difficult place to be as a reporter where you're constantly taught that you are not part of the story. You are supposed to be a fly on the wall. And then at the same time, trying to help people understand that it's really hard and it takes support. It takes financial support. There are salaries that need to be paid to do this work. And so you make a good point too, is like one of the things I think we've lost a lot of just across the country is in-depth reporting where you can spend weeks, maybe even a couple months on a single story that demands that sort of time. And there are stories like that require you to drive all across the state. I mean, we've had stories where some of our reporters are flying places for a single story. And it's hard to translate that single story into dollars when your salary, you might only be working on that for a single month. That's a lot of work. That's really demanding financially, but we do it because we think it's important. And I think readers agree. I mean, what we hear at 7 days constantly is that they come to us because it is in depth, because they know they're going to get the whole story. And people appreciate that.
I mean, the Vermont relapse story you did, how long did you take on that story?
That story was a full month of reporting. It was all I did for an entire month. And that was just for listeners, that was the story last year about Burlington's drug crisis and the way that it's changed over time. And so I would wake up and some days I'd just go out and I'd be out in the community the entire day. And so I think there was a lot of value in that, but at the same time, I can see as a newspaper publisher looking at that's all he did for an entire month, and that costs X amount of dollars that month. It's a tough sell sometimes, and so I appreciate working for an organization that values that type of work.
I remember too, Jasper Craven, when I was working at Vermont Digger, worked on this 7-part series about the Vermont National Guard. I think it's all he worked on for 4 or 5 months. I think of the work Ann Galloway did on the EB5 stuff. I mean, Yeah, it's just, it takes a long time to unravel some of these, Gordian knots.
It does. And I think that the more financially challenged newspapers are, the harder it becomes to justify that kind of work. And that's a problem because there will always be stories that require that amount of depth. And when they go untold, I mean, who knows? Who knows if EB5 never gets told? Or, I mean, there are stories that need to be told and it takes time. And so I think that's the message newspapers are trying to constantly hammer home, is that this is hard work. It takes time and money, and it needs support.
I don't mean this in any kind of a critical way, but you're younger than I am. And, I look at, for example, the unionization effort at Digger. The expectation now is, as a reporter, you work 40 hours a week. That was not the expectation when I was coming up as a cub reporter through the ranks. You worked as long as you needed to. You might go to your managing editor and say, I've worked like crazy on this series and I need a couple of days off. And usually there was a way to kind of make that happen. It's different now.
It is different now. And I think that...
And that's not necessarily to say that the way we did it was the right way, but it's different.
It totally is. And yeah, I don't mean to suggest by the point I made earlier about needing to have things now, that is not to suggest that reporters 40 years ago were doing any less work. I think they were probably doing more work than we're doing now. Just to imagine how much harder it might have been to find out some sort of information that I now have at the tip of my fingers online.
Right.
But I will say that the news is not alone in that. I mean, you go up to the hospital and you talk to some of the physicians there. They are expecting a work-life balance too, when their predecessors might have been working 75 hours a week. I think the challenge is that do we want to be working in an industry where that's the expectation, that you need to work 60 hours to get it done, and how long can you do that for?
Right.
I think for every longtime journalist like you who's had a career in this line of work, there are probably 25 people who jumped ship at the age of 35 and went to work as a PR person at some big organization where they could count on 40-hour weeks, good benefits, and maybe raise a family.
Four times the pay.
And not to mention 4 times the pay. And so, that's the challenge. And that's the challenge as a reporter, knowing that on one hand, I want to make sure that I can do this for my entire career. I want to make this a job where I can see myself at the age of 60 still being able to do something I love, while at the same time being able to afford it and being able to personally deal with the stress. And that's always a challenge.
I love it when a guest leads me right into the next question, which you did, because, institutional memory, we hear that phrase a lot, and it is important. And I look at this effort on the part of the community news service up at UVM. It's great to see young people actually interested in journalism, but it is not a replacement, in my view, for the experience that somebody like you and Kevin, Sasha, Chelsea, Edgar, rest of your group over there. I mean, you remember things now that people don't remember who are just coming out of college.
Yeah, no, I think there's totally a real benefit to having the institutional knowledge, especially as a reporter, where knowing that I've been covering for 10 years now. And so there are times where I'm covering something and think, oh, I've heard this before. Or, I know how this happened. I know how we got here. And I think readers benefit from that, of having the context for some of these stories. I will say about the community news service, I think if you ask them, they would readily tell you this is not a replacement for full-time working journalists, that we should not be just turning all these newspapers into student-run publications. But I do think there is a benefit to making sure that a new generation of reporters wants to be out there doing the work, understands how to do it, and can maybe make a little difference in the process by filling in some of these gaps. The challenge is school is only 4 years. And then you leave, and where are the jobs?
Right. I mean, you're going into a job market, as you say, that in 2000 had 1,500 jobs here in Vermont and now has about 350. I'm thinking maybe I might want to do something else.
Yeah, so I think that's the challenge is But I will say, I will never say that I think we need less people focused on the news, even if you are a younger student who needs some help. And I think there are students out there who do need a bit of guidance, and that's good. I mean, we should expect that. But at the same time, I think it's really hard to replace someone who's been doing this work for a long time and who can spend a month on a story, or who knows exactly who to call and what.
That was one of the points I was going to make. You know who to call. If I threw out a topic to you, you could name 5 people that you would immediately call on it.
And I think there is a real benefit from that. I think it's how do we make these things work together? How do we, I mean, I will say at 7 Days, we have an intern right now, Jack McGuire, who is absolutely crushing it. He is out there working every single day. He's produced probably more stories than anyone at the paper. And some of that's because...
Give it to the intern.
Yeah. Well, some of that's because he's picking up some things that we don't have the time to pick up. But I think it's been a great experience for him. It's been a great experience for us. But I think that's the challenge is these things take a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. But we don't want to just write off someone as, well, you might not know who to call, so we're not going to give you a gig. I think the difference is that back in the day, you had more time to learn on the job. You could get hired somewhere and learn, work your way up and learn. Maybe I'm going out and covering fires every day, and then I learn how to do more news. Nowadays, papers don't have that luxury to hire someone who doesn't know what they're doing.
Right.
They need to expect that you're going to come in and hit the ground running because they only have so much money to go around and they need the content. And so that's the challenge we're in.
Throw them in the deep end.
Yeah.
You did not talk at all about public TV, public radio, the broadcast outlets, including the one I do this for, WCAX. Why did you focus on print and not sort of the whole ecosphere?
Yeah, I think because newspapers are struggling a lot more in many cases. I think Vermont Public is doing pretty well right now. I think after they sold some of the licenses from the PBS merger. And so also CAX, I know Roger Garrity, the news director, was at the journalism conference, and he was on a panel. It was kind of funny. He was on a panel with a group of other publishers. He was asked to sort of, what's your green shoe? Like, what's the one thing that's kind of keeping you going? And he said his message probably doesn't help a lot of other news organizations because they got bought by a corporation.
Right.
And that has been really beneficial for them. He says that their newsroom is bigger than it's ever been. They have the resources now that they might not have had. But I don't think that the answer to local news problems is everybody gets bought by a benevolent overlord, because there aren't a lot of them out there. And so I think that newspapers represented sort of like the most endangered right now, the most in need. And I think that's what appealed to me, as well as I just love newspapers. I mean, there's something about a newspaper that to me is important. And so I hoped that that made sense.
Well, I have a copy of it right here in front of me, your story. I mean, there is something really nice about holding it in your hand, though, I would say the younger generation, it's all, you got to appeal to the phone. But go back here, I didn't quite catch that word. You asked Roger what was that word?
So I think it was a green shoot. Like, what's the one amid all of this struggles? What's the one thing that's making a positive? And so some other newspapers, like Paula Routley of 7 Days, was on there, and hers was the publisher notes that she does every week that have gotten a really good response from readers of helping them understand, peeling back the curtain a little bit of here's how we do the work.
And I would say, and I was a little grisly, but I love reading the obituaries. And that's something that's really expanded in 7 Days. But they are these just wonderful vignettes. I read about people, and I just feel like I learn so much about these incredibly wonderful lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think
and you charge.
Yeah. Well, not to make this a 7 Days podcast, but what I do love about 7 Days is that there is something for everybody in the newspaper, and I think that's partially why it has managed to survive for so long. Is that it's not just news, it's not just arts, it's everything. There's the crossword puzzle, there's the horoscopes, there's even the personals that I think are, some people open up the paper, the first thing they turn to is the back of the paper and see who's looking for some love right now. And I think that newspapers are
Well, you write those in your spare time. You make those all up.
Oh,
right?
totally.
Those are
Yeah. I wish I was that creative. But I think newspapers are trying to think of what are some new ways that we can be a part of people's lives beyond just covering the local select board. And that's a new thing.
All right, when you update this story 5 years from now, when you have 15 years of experience, not 10, how on the ropes are these publications that you wrote about?
I think that they are really on the ropes. I mean, I would not be surprised if 5 years from now we have seen some closures like we have seen in other parts of the country. I think the only thing that might stave off some of that is, frankly, the people working there who are holding on longer than maybe they should be. And I don't know. I mean, it's. I struggled with this of how bleak do we want to be in this story versus there are some things happening on the horizon. The Press Forward initiative, it is a lot of money. Some of that's going to come to Vermont. Maybe that'll make a difference. Maybe enough people will read this story and think more about how they want to spend their money. And maybe it is worth donating $5 to the Addy Indy. But I don't know. I go back and forth because as journalists, we're cynical by nature, I think. And so the cynic in me says that I don't know what the answer is. On the other hand, I like to think there is a bit of us that's eternally optimistic, or why else would you do this work if you don't think it's going to make a difference? And so short answer, I don't know where we're going to be, but I do fear that we're going to be probably in a tougher place than we even are today.
Did you raise the alarm loud enough in this piece that you and Kevin did?
I don't know. That might be up to readers to decide. I mean, part of it is like you need to care about this stuff and so and there's a brief paragraph where I try to make the case of why local journalism is important, but I don't know if that's going to convince anyone. I think it's really individual. Take a look at your life, take a look at where you get your information from, and what do you value? Do you value having local news sources, trusted news sources? And if so, then maybe you need to show that support. But I don't know. It's tough.
Last question. What's the reaction you've gotten from the piece?
We've gotten good reaction, I think. Especially 7 Days readers, a lot of them do value local news. And so I think people were surprised at how bad it has gotten. And I think that more people are paying attention now. And so maybe there is a bit of energy. We'll learn more in the coming months about some of the philanthropy efforts here, and we'll be covering it closely. And hopefully we have some positive news to report soon.
That wraps it up for this edition of 802 News, sponsored by Red Hen Baking Company. I want to thank Colin Flanders for taking the time, and thank you for listening.